Oh, no. No, leave it. Okay. All right. So it's recorded.
It's open. Okay. I will hide the meeting
So the
control.
Zoom records it. Is that that's what you're doing?
Yeah, that's recording. And it's recording already.
Okay, cool. So yeah, you can edit it, right? So yeah.
Oh, yeah. We'll cut.
Otherwise, you'll get us talking now.
Yeah, exactly.
And thank you to your wife for not delivering it.
No, not yet. And she's getting really close.
Oh,
There you go. It doesn't happen in the next 2 hours or 4.
Yeah, that's right.
I told her already.
Yeah. Is your phone just kind of
I need to.
Yes. Yeah. It's a magical thing that's about to happen to you. Just get some sleep now. Like, don't feel free to just go and lie down now. You're not going to get me sleep for weeks.
In the coming weeks, that's a memory. No, I'm really excited. It's more exciting.
Yeah.
So you need, this is recording. Everything is working out.
It doesn't matter if we overrun. Like we can start a bit late, given that people are getting food. Yeah. I mean, okay, we're good.
I do prefer the water.
Just give it to them or like put them on the floor. I feel like that table is too disruptive, right?
We can leave it there and then.
Yeah.
And I will grab the mics.
Yeah.
And 2 mics for them.
Like I don't want.
So maybe 1 and 2 for them. And 3 and 4 for the questions.
3 and 4.
They are in the gallery. By the way, these waters are for you.
Thank you.
Like whoever you get.
So I just speak into this one. Is that?
Who wants to go?
Hang on. Does that work? No.
It will.
Sort of. I mean, I've got a loud voice, so
It will
Okay.
be turned on.
Okay,
I think
cool.
it's
I won't bother with this though because
Okay.
yeah, because
For
I don't
the
want to have to
yeah.
have to hold something.
Yeah.
But we'll take those over
For the
there.
Q&A, yeah.
Just asking, what were you saying the year? Oh, so it was 72%. It's really the same. Yeah. And I'll just go around. Yeah. I think I've looked at that.
Conversation. Interview.
This man was teasing me about my next, especially when
It's like a homeless. You just mentioned the word food. Mention the word. Four letter word.
Yeah, no, I've announced myself making noises. Yeah. Just get my notes out of your head.
Hello. So we're about to start. I know some people are still getting food at the back, but if you can do that quietly, I think we can get started. Hello, and thank you all for joining us today for this lecture in planning series. Our speakers today are Dr. Joe Schaffers and Professor Tom Slater. Before properly introducing our guests, I will begin with a few brief logistical announcements. My name is Samantha Saona Sarabia. I'm a PhD student here at Columbia's Urban Planning Program, and I will be moderating this session. We will be recording today's lecture, so please keep this in mind if you do not wish to be recorded. After the presentation, we will have time for Q&A, and we will be coordinating this with attention to diversity and inclusion. So if you have already had a chance to ask a question, please allow others to ask their own questions before asking a second one. And to ask questions, please raise your hands and we will call on you. There will also be a couple of mics going around the room, so please wait till you get them before asking your questions. It's a big room, so we want to be sure to listen to them properly. So with that, I am delighted to introduce our speakers today. Dr. Schaffers was born in 1939 in the vibrant neighborhood of District 6, Cape Town. In 1966, under the Apartheid Group Areas Act, District 6 was proclaimed an area for white occupation only. Joe, his family, and over 60,000 other residents of color were forced out of their homes, which were then razed to the ground. Residents were scattered into cheaply built housing in different colored townships, quotes on that, miles away from District 6 and miles away from each other. A graduate of Livingstone High School in Claremont, Joe felt a calling and a duty to serve his displaced community. He worked as a health inspector for the City of Cape Town municipality for 34 years, covering every area where displaced people were forced to go, improving standards of living and helping people deal with a psychological trauma of forced eviction. He was awarded several commendations for his work and received the Chairperson's Award for Service Excellence in 1993. In 1998, Joe began working at the District 6 Museum, sharing accounts of forced evictions and their psychological, economic, and social consequences. He has educated hundreds of thousands of visitors to the museum about apartheid, human rights violations, and the dangers of racial domination and stigmatization. In 2022, he was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Edinburgh for his lifelong dedication to preserving the memory of District 6. Please welcome Dr. Joe Schaffers. And we will also be having our very own Professor Tom Slater here from Columbia GSAP, which we all know. So
Yeah.
I'll keep the introduction brief. Thank you so much.
Stuff here. Okay. Hi. This is exciting. This is the world premiere of a research project that's been a long time coming, and one that so far it's become even more fascinating and even more of an occupation than perhaps we ever anticipated. But we're excited to share some initial findings today. And I just want to make two additional welcomes. The first is to the students who take my class Divided Cities. I made this session compulsory for them today, and I think most of them are here. So welcome to those students. And I also want to welcome Loretta Lees, who is here at the front, who was my PhD supervisor about 180 years ago. And it is so lovely to have Loretta here. I'm actually quite nervous. My teacher's here. Like anyway, so it's just wonderful because many of the things I think we're going to talk about today will resonate with some things that Loretta has been working on as well. So I invite Loretta to engage and share things from those experiences. I think this is my pointer. Okay. So, okay, here we go. When I was a geography undergraduate in London in the mid-1990s, I had this amazing teacher, David Smith. He'd done a lot of research in South Africa during the apartheid era, and he spoke very movingly and very beautifully about it on many occasions. And he produced wonderful essays and books. All of it basically changed my life. Now, as I said last night, when I was introducing Joe's wonderful lecture, the collaboration between Joe and I began in April 2004, almost exactly 20 years ago this week. I'd learned about apartheid in District 6 from David. And so I wanted to go to the District 6 Museum in Cape Town, where I met Joe for the first time. And Joe showed me around the district, or what's left of it. We'll learn more about this in a moment. And it was an incredibly generous thing to do, to take me out of the museum and walk me around the ruins of District 6. And like another life-changing moment. Okay, so I had two people who changed my life, David Smith and Joe. And then 12 years later, April 2016, we were reunited. And that's when this picture was taken. I finally got permission to take Edinburgh geography students to Cape Town on a field course. And for 4 straight years, I had the great privilege of learning from Joe alongside my students. Now, Joe talked a lot on those 4 occasions that we had the honor of walking around District 6 with him as a group. He talked a lot about growing up in these buildings here, once a thriving municipal housing community in District 6. A few years ago, it dawned on me that there's a really important story to tell. I mean, the story of District 6 has actually been quite widely told in academia, but the story of this municipal housing community, not so. And it struck me as important because when outsiders talk about municipal housing, social housing, public housing, and so on, people who don't live in that kind of housing, they tend not to talk about community. They don't talk about respect, dignity, love, hope, many other positive, warm human sentiments. But that's what Joe talked about when he talked about growing up there. And so I think years ago, I think I got how to write about territorial stigma. But I'm less good at thinking about how we can use research to destigmatize territories, destigmatize lives. And we're talking in this context of lives where people were robbed of their dignity and their humanity for a long time. So I wanted to dig into the archives. I wanted to meet Joe's former neighbors to listen to what they might have to say about living in this place. I've always been motivated by this Pierre Bourdieu quote about democratizing the craft of interpretation, the need for a more thoughtful reception of ordinary lives. I love that second sentence there. It's one of my all-time favorite sentences. It is necessary, for example, to give the statements of a steel worker the thoughtful reception reserved by a certain tradition of reading for the highest forms of poetry and philosophy. So what I take from that is that we need to pay more attention to ordinary lives, the same kind of attention that we give Shakespeare, right? What people say, and we need to listen, and we need to learn. So that's what I've been up to with Joe. We dug into the archives, and I met Joe's former neighbors last year for a whole day of group interviews. And here's one of the photos of that day. And I put this quote, you can read this as I talk, but right at the end of that session, one of the participants here, I won't say who, she came up to me and she held my hand very tightly, and she would not let go of my hand and looked at me very sternly in my eyes and said that. And there's many things we can read into this. I mean, no pressure then is kind of what I felt. But also, I think my work is cut out to tell their story, to tell the story of where they lived. But I also realized I can't do that without Joe. And so the plan is for us to write this up in a book. So we're doing it together. This is a story of kinship, community, warmth, and love, as well as one of brutal oppression, displacement, pain. In many ways, that's a microcosm of Cape Town, a place of astonishing beauty, but terrible human tragedy. So the story begins here. This is a walk. Oh, it's the walk that Joe, I'm going to take you on the walk that Joe took us on for years. So we're going east up Constitution Street. You'll see on the, it's quite striking Art Deco housing that you see on the right-hand side there. Here's a bit more of it, okay? And you think, well, that's pretty nice, 1930s, you know, solid structures, important point. And then you see closely, you see the name of the development, and it's called Skyways, okay? By the way, there's Table Mountain in the background. This is very centrally located, valuable land. Hold that thought. I don't know if you can see just here. Oh, I think I know how to use the pointer now. Oh, my pointer. I didn't know how to use this last night. Okay, that says Arlanda, right? That's the name of Stockholm's airport. That one, here we go, Mirabel, right? Which is an airport in Montreal, I believe. Okay, so all of these buildings are named after European airports, okay? Now, Mirabel's actually in Canada, but I guess it's, you know, kind of European enough for it to be joining the bunch here of genuine European airports. This is a Google Maps photo of what this development looks like. It's quite a sizable development of housing, but this is what this place is now called, Skyways, with buildings named after European airports. My favorite, Heathrow. Now, I don't know how many of you in this room have ever spent any time in Heathrow Airport, but you think, well, who in their right bloody mind would name a place after Heathrow Airport with a straight face? But this is what's happened. And now this is a video I stole from the website of the marketing for this place. And I'm just going, I hope that the sound works, but this is it. Yes, it does work. So this is Heathrow. It goes on and on, you get the picture. Okay, so this is just one apartment in Heathrow. This is what it costs to rent an apartment in this development. That might seem very low by New York standards. I promise you by Cape Town, that is not cheap. Okay, this is expensive. And this, Loretta will probably attest to this. As a scholar of gentrification, for some reason, we spend time looking at how places are sold, right? How marketing takes place, okay? This I just found utterly astonishing, okay? So this is the website for Skyways. There's a few things here I just want to point out. First of all, that they call it Zonneblum, the neighborhood, okay? And this is what District 6 was renamed as during the apartheid era, but it's now called District 6 again in a post-apartheid era. But the website retains Zonneblum, no association with District 6. And then it says here at the bottom, it's trying to sell grungy dive bars as a gentrification kind of experience. And I just find this kind of stuff utterly astonishing and actually quite nauseating how it's being sold, given the history of this place. And if you're not feeling nauseous, you may do. So finish your lunch and I'll get to the history of this place in a second. So this is how this place is sold. Just to give you an indication of the central location, this is Skyways here. This is the central business district of Cape Town. This is north, so this is going east. Constitution Street, which was the road that we just walked up there. This is this one. This is a large technical college. Now it's called the Cape Peninsula University of Technology, I believe. And the rest of this area is what was District 6. You'll notice there's a lot of vacant land there, which Joe will tell you why a bit later on. Okay, so this is just to give you an idea of the location. Here's I like Google Maps when it has these relief, you can really get an idea of the location here. So this is the area we're talking about, okay? A large area, very close to the central business district and Table Mountain. And, you know, we're talking prime land, okay? Crucial point. Now, are there any clues as to what Skyways once was? Well, just one, that sign, Blumhoff Street. Skyways was once the Blumhoff Flats, which was named after a market garden called the Blumhoff Estate. Now, if you go to the District 6 Museum, you will get a sense of what the Blumhoff Flats was, but that's really all there is when you actually walk past this area to identify what it once was. There's just been one attempt to talk about the Blumhoff Flats in scholarship. A historian by the name of Shamil Jeppy wrote a short piece in an edited collection on the curation of the District 6 Museum. But there's a story, I mean, it was a wonderful piece, but I felt there were some things that needed fleshing out. And so that's what we're going to attempt to do today. So Cape Town's early history was murky, violent, and unsettling. Now, colonialist hyperbole has it that the city was founded in 1652 by the Dutch East India Company, which needed a refreshment station for its ships on their trade routes. But there's a historian by the name of Patrick Mellett who wrote a book called The Lie of 1652, because there were settlements there much earlier than the Dutch East India Company of the indigenous San and Khoi people. So there was a settlement for indigenous people's subsistence agriculture and fishing communities well before Cape Town existed, but there were people there. The place wasn't discovered by the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch and the British basically simply stole these lands and settled on them, a familiar but depressing story of plunder, genocide, and slavery. The area in question today has always been prize land, land that has been contested for nearly 400 years. In the 18th century, it was taken from the indigenous peoples by Dutch slave owners, and they built a market garden. And they built a house for themselves. This is called Blumhoff House, and it became a centerpiece of what was a very profitable small business. Slaves and horses lived together in a wing of this artist's rendition of the house. So that's where the slaves and the horses lived. The slave owner lived there. And this is a map of what the estate looked like in 1897. So you can see the market gardening, the long entrance driveway. And this is the only photograph that exists of the Blumhoff house that I could find. So the British slave merchant Richard Payne Jones took over the estate from the Dutch, reflecting the history of who ruled Cape Town when. And slavery was abolished in Cape Town in 1834. And then a flour merchant by the name of Daniel Mills, and what a great last name for somebody associated with flour. This merchant took over, and it remained in his family for the first 3 decades of the 20th century. Now, up until the mid-19th century, the wider area of the city that contained the Blumhoff land was known as Cannaladorp, deriving from the Malay word canala, meaning to help one another. It only became District 6 after the Municipal Act of 1867, which divided the city into 6 legislative districts. Districts 1 to 5 did not retain their names. So Cape Town's urbanization saw expansion away from the castle, which is just off this map here. So this is the Castle of Good Hope up here. And so the city expanded away from that original colonial settlement. This was facilitated by the coming of railways and tramways. Wealthier residents migrated out of the center of the city into new suburbs. So those who remained in District 6 were mostly poor, who also needed to be near the city center and especially near to the port to find employment. At the start of the 20th century, District 6, as we learned from Joe yesterday, was a very high density, mostly lower class neighborhood with a population drawn from all over the world, reflecting that port city history. So who lived there? Well, it's a reflection of a colonial history. So you have, I mean, in a way, I'm repeating things that Joe said last night. You had a complete cultural mix living in this one densely populated area. So you had the symbolic and the literal and symbolic center of so-called colored culture in Cape Town. I'll get to these categories in a moment. The colored population of a category imposed on people of mixed heritage. But you also had thousands of Jews from what are now Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, several thousand indigenous peoples from the Eastern Cape of South Africa. You had San and Khoi peoples from all over sub-Saharan Africa. You had considerable numbers of Indians, Chinese, and Australians. So a cultural mix and a religious mix, as Joe went through last night. You name a religion and District 6 had it. District 6 became an extremely vibrant part of central Cape Town. It contributed in a very substantial way to Cape Townian and South African culture. It was the birthplace of world-renowned writers, musicians, dancers, actors, politicians, teachers, lawyers, doctors, and intellectuals. It formed its own unique cuisine even. It had a dialect of Afrikaans all of its own. It was well provided with schools, churches, synagogues, mosques, cinemas, shops, fish, meat and vegetable markets, cafes, restaurants, pubs, garages, workshops, industrial buildings, and other amenities. And it took no more than 10 minutes to walk into the center of Cape Town. Like many working class, centrally located neighborhoods in port cities, District 6 had its problems. There was severe disinvestment in people's lives, absentee landlordism, overcrowding. There were gangsters. There were many problems with criminality. People did live in entrenched poverty. But District 6 had a soul. There is abundant evidence that it was a truly remarkable community. There are so many oral histories of what it was, and we have a living example. We had one last night. Perhaps most interestingly, there are no examples in the historical record of racial, religious, or cultural antagonisms between residents. One thing that flows through all the memories of former District 6ers is respect for each other as people, regardless of what you looked like or what you worshipped, regardless of your culture. But for most of its existence, District 6 was perceived, portrayed, and stigmatized by people who did not live there as a degenerate slum, a place only of vice and crime, an embarrassment to the mother city of South Africa. George Bernard Shaw, in his usual fairly pompous way, said this when he arrived in 1932 in Cape Town, but he was simply reflecting the attitudes of many towards this neighborhood. Now, regarding the specific tract of land, the Bloemhof estate, there was a part of the immediate vicinity of that market gardening area I told you about, Wells Square. This area became notorious for degradation, for vice, for violence and squalor. The square remained for a long time the center of a big public debate about housing the poor. It was synonymous with urban poverty, and clearing it up became symbolic of the council's intentions to rid the city of its blemishes. But the square was only one small part of a much larger problem of poverty, and campaigning against squalor would be actually a central part of Cape Town politics for decades. For instance, Bishop Lavis, the Anglican Archbishop of the city, in 1927, he authored a series of articles in the Cape Times on the subject of slums, pleading for reform of such conditions. Another thing, and this is crucial, there was town planning for the first time. Most of you in this room are studying urban planning. It was promoted in the press in the late 1920s, and planning models in England and the British Empire were given as worthy of imitation. In particular, Ebenezer Howard's Garden City movement. And in fact, Ebenezer Howard served as a consultant to the city of Cape Town in the 1920s. Now, planning for a modern Cape Town meant exercising power and control. Authorities felt that they had lost control due to the physical form of areas such as Wells Square. And this is the sort of the census of Wells Square in the late 1920s. So these are comments made by city councillors, actually in the decade earlier, but there were strong desires among the city's elites to govern the city in a new way via spatial planning. And it was deemed necessary to render visible the spaces over which government was to be exercised. The spaces that were out of control, such as areas deemed to be slums, would be brought back into the realm of political domination and social domination. So that was the motivation, political and social. The Slums Act of 1934 was a watershed moment for South Africa, not just urban South Africa, not just Cape Town. National legislation affecting the 8 largest cities in the country modeled on English legislation, again, granting legal powers for councils to expropriate land. In Cape Town, taking the city as a whole, this came hand in hand with the mobilization of the Garden City movement that I mentioned earlier. Low-density housing, advocacy of decentralization, green belt buffer zones, for any of you that remember reading about Ebenezer Howard. And it lent itself beautifully to the implementation of residential segregation. It was compatible with segregationist sentiments held by all levels of government. These levels of government were less interested in Ebenezer Howard's ideas about organic communities forming. How can we segregate people according to skin color and according to social class? And so those ideas of the Garden City seemed more important than anything about creating communities. The Slums Act emerged on the back of detailed surveys of residential property in 1932 and 1933, ordered by the Medical Officer of Health for the city of Cape Town. This is just a summary of how District 6 was treated by the Slums Act of 1934. It contained no legislation whatsoever to rehouse people displaced by slum clearances that were being promoted at this time, solely concerned with slum demolition, and specifically for this to proceed without the accompanying provision of any alternative accommodation. There's a book which if you're interested in these issues, which I've always found helpful, Peter Maris, a scholar of displacement. He said this in a book that was published, I think, 1981, but then there was a second edition about 7, 8 years later. Crime, drunkenness, prostitution, feckless poverty, and mental pathology do indeed cluster where housing is poorest, though not there only. Once this association has been taken for granted, any anomalous pattern of life embodied in shabby surroundings is easily assumed to be pathological without much regard for the evidence. Bad housing thus becomes a symbol of complex discordances in the structure of society, and this is crucial, and so to be treated as if it were a cause of them. I've never seen a better description of how slum stigma is activated and amplified in order to either segregate people or displace people. And usually the motivation is to get valuable land and convert it into exchange value from use value. So the Housing and Slum Clearance Special Committee of the City of Cape Town, it was formed right after the Slums Act of 1934. So there were 3 avenues open to the council. There they are. And under Section 17 of that Act, the council could acquire by agreement or expropriation any land comprised in a slum or any land adjoining or near to such land, if it considered it necessary or useful to form an area of convenient shape and dimensions for satisfactory development. These are crucial sentences that explain how the Bloemhof Flats, which we're about to talk about, how it emerged. The first and only such area was Wells Square, which was expropriated together with the adjoining market garden, by then abandoned, and surrounding properties. And landlords were compensated. Even though they had been neglectful landlords, they were paid. They were paid off, basically. Here you go, here's some money. We'll take this land because we want to put it to a different use. Now, and this is a crucial organization in how the Bloemhof Flats was constructed and ultimately how social life in the Bloemhof Flats, which Joe's going to talk about in a moment, how things unfolded in this development. The Citizen Housing League was a body representative of about 30 civic organizations, chaired by Bishop Lavis, the Anglican Archbishop who I mentioned earlier, and it played a role in responding to the housing crisis in Cape Town. It's noteworthy that Dr. Abdullah Abdurrahman, the first person of color to be elected to the Cape Town Municipal Council, representing District 6, was on the board of this league. Later, so was his daughter, Sissy Gould, probably District 6's best-known political activist, the first woman of color to be elected to the council. What this organization did was it put pressure on politicians to do something, not just in terms of building housing, but to provide community facilities with it. It says very specifically here, the City Council should consider the erection of a large number of accommodation, new flats with community facilities. Nobody was talking about this. So there was a pressure group that said, you can't just build housing. You have to think about people's lives in housing, right? So there were these organizations that came together, this body, the Citizens Housing League. Now, what happened was Wells Square was completely demolished, razed to the ground. 700 people were displaced and they were not rehoused, mostly because of the stigma attached to Wells Square. And in fact, the Housing and Slum Clearance Committee going to wash their hands of everything and said the national government should be approached on providing housing for people who are going to lose their homes here. We don't want anything to do with it. But that actually reflects the level of the stigma on this particular site. Now, this is the foundation stone unveiling for what became the Blumhof Flats. This is 29th of August, 1938. You won't be able to read that, so I've typed it out for you. So this tablet has been erected by the City Council of Cape Town and was unveiled by His Worship the Mayor on the 29th day of August to commemorate an important step in the city's slum clearance campaign and as witness of the city's determination to proceed steadfastly with the great task of completing rehousing of the poorest sections of its citizens. So this was the foundation for what became the Blumhof Flats. Initially, the tablet actually included what I've put there. Upon this site stood for many years the notorious Wells Square, one of Cape Town's worst slums. But actually, that Citizens Housing League even was affected by the stigma. It said, oh no, we just need to bury that memory. Let's have a fresh start, a clean slate. This was how certain areas were treated at this time. So what then was built? Here it is. So, I mean, I showed you those pictures earlier, Google Maps pictures of skyways. I mean, something has changed, obviously quite a lot, but it's still the kind of outline structure is the same. These are the architectural drawings of what became known officially as the non-European sub-economic housing scheme at Canterbury Square and Blumhof, designed by two architects from Edinburgh. 11 blocks of flats were constructed, lettered A to L, a total of 370 2- and 3-bedroom units. So it was first approved 1935, designed the same year, opened 1939, and the whole development was completed in 1940 with a loan from the central government. And the idea was, if you look at the architectural drawings and read what the architects say, it was to create a mini garden city, right? And so the idea was you create these blocks of flats and you have areas for recreation. But interestingly, there was no community facilities, but there's a key change that comes, I'm going to show you in a minute, in terms of what was actually constructed. So this was what emerged on the site, and tenants were to be selected. So the Housing and Slum Clearance Committee were responsible for deciding who could move into the Blumhof Flats. Rent was to be set at those rates. Eligibility to apply mean you had to be in regular employment to get one of these flats. And your family income had to be no more than £3 a week, because anything more than that, and it wouldn't be what was officially termed sub-economic housing at the time. The income standard, though, could not be trusted alone, according to the councillors involved. So all applicants had to attend interviews with the City Council, where they would be assessed for sober and clean living habits. All flats were to be unfurnished, and this just shows how the stigma attached to not just places, but people. Okay, so people were assumed to be contaminated, and all their belongings were too. So everything had to be fumigated before people are allowed to move their furniture into these flats. And then once they were occupied, this shows the systems of surveillance and social control that were put in place. There were weekly inspections of flats that were undertaken by the municipality, and you risked eviction if you did not have a clean and tidy flat and you did not keep up. So the idea, the fear was that another Wells Square would appear in the site if they didn't do something about the behavior of the tenants. Okay, so that was how things were done. Just to show you the physical changes, this is District 6 in 1926. This is the Blumhof estate when it was a market garden, or by then an abandoned one. This is the Wells Square area. And there's what happened. So the Blumhof Flats, and this is actually the Canterbury Flats. And this whole area is actually renamed Canterbury Square. Yeah. And that is what was constructed by, opened in 1940, but that image from 1945. Now, one of the kind of tantalizing parts of this one piece of scholarship that's only ever been written on the Blumhof Flats is where the author says the intentions of the planners and the residents diverged. Over time, the space was made into territory owned by the residents. They played by the rules of the council in paying rents and so on, but they made out of their space their own private and collective worlds. And it's so frustrating. I remember reading this thinking, well, how did they do that? And then I thought, hang on, there's your research question, Tom. And then I asked Joe if we could meet the neighbors that Joe had in the Blumhof Flats. And then I spent a day in Cape Town in February where I met Joe's neighbors. And Joe was there as well. He's just behind me in the picture. And we had this extraordinary discussion basically about how people did this, what was life like in the Blumhof flats. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Joe, and he's going to tell you about life in the Blumhof flats.
Yeah.
Because he can do the, I mean, I've got all these interview quotations, but we have Joe here. So that saves me time reading them out. And I'll go through, another thing is I'm about to show you some photos that are a compilation of photos from the District 6 Museum, but also there were photos that were given to me by people who attended this focus group discussion, which I scanned and put in here. And so it'll give you a sense, as Joe's talking, as to what the place looked like and what social life was like in this.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Good afternoon, everybody. What we're really looking at here is a collection of people living in an area which is supposed to be the modern outlook of communal living. And as you can see in what Tom had said, there was a special way you were sort of selected, was a selection process in which you could get your space. But it was also very selective in that, and I must point this out also, and I don't think Tom alluded to that, that you notice that it was only people of a certain race group. I don't know if you noticed that, Tom. There was no other color other than so-called colored people, which in those days wasn't mentioned as such. And as I was born in these flats in that time, in 1939, as my dad said, when the cement was still wet. So we had just moved into those spaces. The whole setup was, how do we get a whole group of people to live in an area and give them almost autonomy, whereby within that complex, we'll have everything that they really need. So inside those spaces, they eventually built a community center. And this community center had a hall in it, had a library in it, had of course, a nursery in it. There was a rent office in it. So everything was sort of centralized. Those people didn't have to go out to go and pay their rent. Or if you missed your rent, there was another space down the road where you could go and pay your rent. Because people were very scared to miss out on their rent because they could be evicted. So you'd find that people paid when the time was due. Even if it meant you had to run down to town later on to go and pay it, because not everybody got paid at the same time. And I remember many a day I had to run down to the city to go and pay that rent. Because my mom said, if you don't do it, we'll be out by tomorrow. Which is a lot of bull, but in any case, that's what they put into the people's minds. And as you can see what the blocks were like, these were sadly neglected after a while. These were all rockeries here. They were rockeries that were attended by municipal workers. And they were beautiful, well-designed. And you look at those buildings, they've been neglected. That was part of the removal process. When people were being shifted out, slowly but surely, the city council started neglecting painting, whereas every 2 or 3 years, there would be a complete painting of all those blocks of flats outside. You were responsible for the interior of your place. And they gave you what was known as a powdered paint called Morello, which was a terrible thing because you put it on the wall and the next minute all that would be on your clothing because it was just the cheapest paint you could possibly get. But of course, we were very innovative people. So somebody discovered if you mixed a lot of salt with it, it'll stay on the walls. So of course, you'd find people doing this. But my dad was of another culture and he decided he's not going to have Morello, he's going to paint his walls, which then started a new trend. So people started painting the walls. So your interior of your place didn't have to be painted every year. So you could paint your wall and the paint you could wash off. So it was much easier and much simpler also. Within that space on your walls, we had what is known as picture rails. Little picture rails where you could hang your pictures on. But what the reality of that, it was solid brass. So that became another job for you, especially as living in the plots. When it comes close to the end of the year season, those brass rods have to be polished. They have to be brassoed. And our parents were tyrants on that. That thing had to shine like you cannot believe. And there was a lot of brass in those places. We had what you put on the floor was it's called linoleum. Because it was cork floors, so they used to put linoleum on top of that. That was polished and washed every week because you had the council ladies coming around to look at. You also had you can see that's my mom. Just go back, Tom.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, that's my dad at the back there. That's my mom, and it's an aunt of mine standing in front of it. And that's my niece sitting on one of the walls. And you can see how solidly those buildings were built. And everybody had a turn once a week to wash down all the stairs. So from every floor, the 4 floors, each person had a turn. And that notice was put at the back of your door inside. So you would know when it was your turn to do the washing. And it washed from the top right down to the bottom. That meant using things like Jay's fluid and keeping the place spotless and what have you. So it was very, very staunch and stern method that people adhere to. He was one of the caretakers, Mr. Lane. They used to come around and we had caretakers inside the space. And there was one chap by the name of Mr. Bucas, which looked the part, acted the part of a typical Nazi general. Come along, and he later on started setting a time frame that everybody had to be off the floors of Bloemhof Flats by 9 o'clock at night. And he became known as Mr. 9 o'clock. So at that time, when he comes around, you off the floor. And of course, they worked on your parents' nerves because the parents were threatened. If your children don't listen, you'll be kicked out. So we then started a system, of course. As we grew older, we just didn't want to adhere to this law of, I mean, we were adults. How can you tell us at 9 o'clock we must be off the floor? But he stuck to that. And of course, the council was on his side. So he carried out this rather strict way of keeping us tied down. You can see the balconies, and they're quite long. And people used to do the washing down themselves. And down the stairs. And downstairs we had what is known as washing lines, where people did their washing inside and they could hang their washing downstairs and then bring it up again when it's dry. And of course, they did their washing and ironing. At the back there, you can see that is the Bloemhof Community Center. Yeah, go back there. Yeah, that's the Bloemhof Community Center. This building in front was the rent office. Upstairs, living in a beautiful compartment, was Mr. Bucas. And he was a so-called white man with his wife and his 2 dogs. But then, in hindsight, when Mr. Bucas left, you realize what he was actually trying to do. Because when he left, you started finding that the bad elements were starting to come in. And that is what he prevented. And we didn't see that. We didn't know that. But this is what he was doing, and we never saw it. But in the hall, you could see what they had, all the types of games, table tennis, badminton. That was run by well, I did the table tennis. My brother Johnny did the badminton. Ballet was run by various people that belonged to the E. Owen group. That was a very, very large group, a very cultural group in the city of Cape Town. And the nursery was run by Mrs. Feeder and Sister Berry. They did the nursery school. Gymnastics was run by Mr. Stoffels, Mr. Flores, Mr. Johannes. And then there was 1 or 2 of those guys that came out of gymnastics that actually landed up in Sweden. They became gymnasts over there and they brought back. So we learned a lot and they landed up in Sweden. And cooking Solomons had done, Mr. Solomons, of course. And there were sewing classes. Weightlifting was Alex Thomas. They called him Boere because he was a big burly, fair skin colored. But the Dutch were known as Boere, so they just named him Boere. As I said, we used to give each other nicknames. And the library was run by William Mullins and Mr. Musson. So we had a full-on library that you could borrow your books from and go and sit and learn and study there. Percy Wilkins and Mr. Solomons, of course. And they were first-aid classes. But we also had various churches on Sundays. They'd have their services inside the community center. The community center also had a hall in it where you could do your dances. You could have your private functions. So Bloemhof Flats actually became a community within a community. But it didn't stop us allowing people from outside to come in there, to come and share what we had, because they never had it. So we had a lot of our chops coming from outside that joined our soccer clubs, that joined our cricket clubs, that joined our athletic clubs, yes. Joined our athletic clubs. And so we were able to educate and raise the standards surrounding. And it's not only, as you can see there, there's called the Bloemhof Crusaders, and you can see the amount of trophies these guys won. You can imagine how talented they were in the instruments that they played. And it was all musical instruments they played, not a singing group. Here they are in their full regalia at one of the flats. And the photo was taken. I've still got some. One or two of them are still alive, but most of them have passed on, because that's a good couple of years ago. But music played a major part in District 6 also. And we even had some of our guys that came out of Bloemhof Flats, although the council frowned upon it, called minstrels. But we never had minstrels inside Bloemhof Flats. They were outside of Bloemhof Flats. And District 6 became very, very famous for your minstrels, which over the festive season used to wander through the areas. Your Christmas choirs used to go over the Christmas period. They used to play hymns. It was all hymns, very religious. Whereas your minstrels played your music from across the world. And they covered the whole of the city, Cape Town city, the streets and what have you. You can switch over.
Yeah.
Here we have a table tennis club, which I belong to, Liberman. And of course, I couldn't be in the picture because I took the photo. So you miss out on that. But you see, we had table tennis clubs as well in those areas. So District 6 had a lot of activities that kept people going. It wasn't just as people had put it as a slum-ridden area. There were a lot of activities. We had rugby clubs, we had soccer clubs, we had table tennis clubs, we had bodybuilding clubs. We had the Eon group, where it was a very highly cultural thing. They did all the operas like La Traviata, Madame Butterfly. All those were done, and they were done in the City Hall in Cape Town, even during the apartheid years, although there had to be separate city seating for whites and so-called coloreds. Then, of course, you had your notices were put up at your various areas. And it was, as it says, that was called the Separate Amenities Act. We had a couple of acts, your Separate Amenities Act, your Immorality Act, your Mixed Marriages Act, your Group Areas Act, all that kind of acting. They should have won Oscars, going to show you they did it. Yeah, yeah. But these would sort of reserve a special place for people of color and for whites. And you'd find that our beaches were always the worst beaches, where there were riptides and there were rocks. So you either learned to swim or you drowned. One of the two. You had no options in between. And so we had very, very good swimmers, because that's where you learn to do, you survive. And then, of course, these were the various Group Areas Acts. And they were proclaimed by the government as it. And you'd find that it started out in the more affluent white areas. So it started out in places like Camps Bay, Sea Point, Mully Point, Green Point, below the slopes of Signal Hill.
I got you pointed out.
Yeah.
So you can press the button there.
Now I'm a fossil with these things. Yeah, okay. When you're 300 years old, you get caught up in these things. It buggers your mind up. Now we had Bloemhof Flats was over here, which of course later became known as Zonnebloem, after we'd been kicked out. And those people living there, you can see they're within walking distance, the place to work, the schools, the churches, the recreation areas, and the shops. Suddenly the area is declared as a white area in 1966. And then in 1984, they started destroying the areas and moving us out. And then they started taking us out of this areas over here and taking us to areas such as Windermere, Factorton, Kensington, which was the closest. But eventually landing in this huge area that is generally known as the Cape Flats. Geographically speaking, your Cape Flats is everything between your Atlantic Ocean and your Indian Ocean, which is False Bay, consisting of sandy, windy, Port Jackson covered areas. And here we were placed into what is known as townships. Townships, as I alluded to last night, that was based on your Nazi ideology of ghettos. But unlike those ghettos, we had no bomb fence and gun towers to protect. But we were racially divided and entrenched in these areas by means of railway lines, highways, rivers, and industrial areas. But you can see how far away from the city we were placed. Where I lived before, in Bloemfontein, it used to take me 20 minutes to walk to work, 20 minutes to walk back. So they landed in one of the areas called over here, which is called Hanover Park, which is close to Manenberg, Highlands Estate, this area over here, Hanover Park over there. Then it took me an hour, hour and a half by bus to get to where I lived and worked in the city. Now I can imagine what this did to people financially. It used to take me 20 minutes to walk, so all I really had was shoe leather at the beginning. But suddenly you find yourself that far out of the city. The having is cost. And when you were kicked out of these specific areas, your salaries wouldn't increase. But your financial burdens increase. So what do you think is going to happen to people? They're going to become poorer and poorer, poorer. And as your poverty sets in, so does depression. And with depression setting in, what do many people resort to? Your drinking. Your drinking is then followed by your drugs. Your drug is followed by your gangsterism. And that set the tone for your areas in those specific areas over there. I worked every depressed area as a health inspector, and I was telling Tom, I worked for a very, very affluent firm, fishing firm, in the city of Cape Town, where I was earning, in a sense, white salary. But I always felt this wasn't the space for me. I needed to work with my community. Because I was seeing the suffering. I felt the suffering of the people because I was part of it. And then sitting in the office one day, I looked at the newspaper and I saw what was advertised was for health inspectors. I thought, okay, that looks like a thing I could do because it meant working with your community. And then my boss came past and said, well, Joe, what are you doing? So I said, I'm just looking at this. And he says, okay, go for it. Why don't you go for it? Because it also includes being your hygiene officer as well. And we are fishing concern, become the health inspector, and we'll see where we could place you. So 2 years later, qualifying, he said, right, good Joe, you're done. Where can we place you? Now, it would have been a feather in the cap of the firm also. I'd been the first so-called person of color working in this huge concern in the food industry. And I said, no, thank you for everything, but I'm resigning. He says, what? What have you been smoking? So I said, no, I am serious. I feel that I can do more amongst my community out there. But he says, Joe, you're going to earn about a third of what you're earning now. That's just not about a salary. That's what I can do. I see the suffering each and every day. And I just felt the need to go and work there. I then left that space. And as I walked out of the door, he says, Joe, that door is always open for you if ever you want to come back again. But I went to go and work amongst the community, and for 34 years, I worked each and every depressed area. And I know exactly what those people went through because I went through with them. So Tom,
The
yeah.
Blumhoff Flats.
Okay.
So this was the 1966 declaration of District 6 as a white area. And these are some of the photographs of District 6 being demolished. This shows,
Yeah.
well, Joe can talk you through that.
Yeah, I just want to tell you about that particular street. This is called Richmond Street. And on your left-hand side, you can see a very busy street. You can almost hear the noises coming out of the street. On your right-hand side, Tom, can just point to the church over the side over here. No? That is the Moravian church. Right on the top where those arches are, that's where these so-called white folk lived. And on your left-hand side are the homes that people of color lived, single-story, double-story structures. And you can see it's a very busy street. You can almost hear the noises coming out of the street. Now, that is Richmond Street in 1961. On your right-hand side, that is Richmond Street in 1984. Only your church is left on your right-hand side, and right at the top, where the so-called white folk live. Everywhere else, total desolation, isolation, and silence, as we're kicked out of those areas.
Showed these photos last night. This shows 1953, 1968. You can see the clearances in the beginning. 1977, District 6, 1983. Just go back to 1977. You see the Blumhoff Flats is still largely intact. 1983, you see there's 2 blocks that have gone. And we'll just show you some photos in a minute of that.
Yeah.
But what happened, and Joe's going to tell you now about the disinvestment that took place that was part of this process of evicting people to the Cape Flats. So I've got photos of it.
You see now, if you look at those flats and they're neglected, they've been allowed to go that way. And this is actually taken from where I used to live, the balcony. That quad at the bottom used to be the washing lines. We also played our cricket and stuff like that. And you can see it's quite a high building. So just to give you some idea of what activities we caught on. So we used to play cricket downstairs. Now we play with tennis balls, and we hit the tennis balls on the roof. It's just 4 stories up. Now, that means your game is interrupted. So now we have to get that balls out of the gutter up there again. So the tall guy like me had to go up and walk along the wall on the top, feeling your hands in the gutter to get those balls out so the game can continue again. And you can see how close the windows are to where you are playing. That just shows our spirit of community. Now, you are playing cricket and you pull the ball, you hit the window, it breaks. The family in that house, the mother, of course, is going off the deep end because the window is broken. But no problem. Within 10, 15 minutes, we'll be there to put in a new window because we had a couple of guys working for a plate glass factory. So we always had windows to replace those. So the game could just go on. But you look at this block, which is block C, that is where I used to live, and you can see how high those blocks were. And they consist of 3 and 2 bedrooms. But if you look at the views, that's Table Mountain behind you. And your views from this side would be right over the city, over the docks, over the bay, and over the mountains. So you can understand the value of these properties. And then you can see this building right at the top. That's where my late wife used to live. And I lived 2 blocks away, so the courtship was very cheap because I didn't have to take any tram, buses or trains or taxis.
This is the last days of the...
And these are people being moved out. And you can see how the place is being neglected. They're allowed to go to ruin. And you can still see people saying they're almost waving their last goodbyes. That rubble at the back is the other Blumhoff flats I lived in, and that was left out of it.
We do have a short film here.
Yeah, you can put
The
it in there.
last days of the Blumhoff Flats and people moving their furniture, going through the process of eviction. So.
concept. Of the farm. I think, right?
I mean, the whole thing is that the people is feeling, you see, frustrated because why must the people move? The whole thing is just me, them, they are all humanity. So why must human be moved like pigs? It's not a crowd. You can move sheep, whatever you see. I mean,
People are very unhappy about moving
we
this time.
are unhappy.
Is there anything you can do?
I mean, the whole thing is we can't do nothing because the government is against us. You see? There is no such thing as we can do anything against it, because the whole thing, if we do something, then we are the criminals.
And all those people were taken out of those areas in the center of the city, within walking distance of work, the schools, the churches, the recreation areas, and the shops. All ripped out and then put into those townships that were placed out there. And he wouldn't take it as a community. Only divided the rule. So individually you're taken out and you're scattered among total strangers. And these are communities of 30, 40, 50 years. So everybody knew each other. There was always Auntie Millie, Auntie Bill, Uncle Bill, Auntie Sally. If anything goes wrong, because it's right close to you. Now suddenly this is taken away from you. Now I can imagine what this did to people are 70, 80, 90 years old. Suddenly you're uprooted, you are thrown, and you're thrown among total strangers. When I lived here, I knew virtually everybody in that place. I lived there 28 years, but everybody knew me. Suddenly we landed up in another park. I didn't know my neighbor on my left, my right, front of me, behind me, above me, even above that. We're all sitting isolated. Many of those old people just gave us the ghost in their time. Some people committed suicide because they don't understand the color of their skin that caused them all this misery. And where we lived in Bloemer Flats, within 5 minutes, you could be 6, 7 different shops. There were shops in every corner. The center of your city was 10 minutes away. Suddenly we moved out there. We had one little shop. Then I had to walk about half a kilometer to get another little shop. But you had to navigate through areas that you didn't know. So it became risky because of the gang elements that were starting to develop.
Okay, so just to add a little bit more from that focus group discussion, one of the things which came from that discussion with Joe's neighbors, I mean, you've seen it through Joe here, is that the pain of the removals is still raw 50 years on, right? So the sense I got from people at that day was not only the incredible warmth of the community that existed, and in many ways still exists, even though it's scattered, but the humiliation that people felt, so much so that life became this perpetual search for dignity. And so you've heard this from Joe, and there's many quotes I could have read out, but in a way there's no need because of Joe's presence here today. But then what was interesting is that Joe and I, during the same time, we actually visited one of these areas together.
Yeah.
How do you pronounce it again?
Which?
Nooit gedacht.
Nooit gedacht.
No, okay, I'm not even going to attempt that. But
Nooit
anyway,
gedacht.
nooit gedacht. And so what was interesting here is that we made, it was actually a friend of Joe's called Charles Abrahams, who's now become a very successful lawyer. And he has retained a presence in this community. And through that, we were able to walk around this community, but only in the presence of these women, which was for our safety. Because if men had showed us around the neighborhood, it would have led to issues in terms of gang tensions. And these are the kinds of things that Joe had to deal with every day as a health inspector. But when I was walking around here with Joe, there were a few I had many emotions walking around this area as Joe was explaining to me, the work that he was doing, and the women who we walked with were telling me about their everyday lives. And the thing, not only was there this sort of sense of fear that dominates everything, But there was the whole place, even in the middle of the day,
Yeah.
on a weekend, was dead.
Dead,
There was
yeah.
just nobody around. And I asked one of the women who we were walking with, why is that? And the answer was, it's just too dangerous for children to play outside. And so those kinds of things obviously were never existed in the Blumhof flats. And as one of the kind of afterlives, I suppose, of this process of removal and eviction. What I'm going to do now is just tell you a bit about what happened to the Blumhof flats to lead us back to where I began, right? How did they become skyways? Well, Joe, this is
That's
the
my
demolition of Joe's
That's my
home.
flat.
This is where 2 of the blocks were demolished, Joe's and another one, Block C and Block
Jay.
J. And these are the photos of these processes taking place in the
Sorry,
1980s.
Tom, can you see how solid those structures were?
Hmm.
It took about 5 to 6 weeks to destroy one of those. And what was it destroyed for? Because the developer needed parking space for white people's cars. Can you believe it? They throw out 32 families out of each one of those blocks, and 64 families. And I normally just get the goats from the people I say. Now, this is supposedly the intelligent speaking. If he had put in 32 families in those and charged R1 million for each one, you would have got 32 million rand for each block at 64 million rand. But no, he destroys it, takes it right to the ground, then builds little garages so they can park their car. How much can you charge for a garage per month? Then I ask the question now, where is the so-called intelligence of this so-called? Could have had 34 and 32 million rand in his pocket straight away. How long do you think it's going to take to get 32 million by charging for 500 and 1,000 rand per month for a flat, for a garage? But it's a case of we can do this because we can. That was that.
I'll talk you through the formal processes. So group areas evictions were under the auspices of the Orwellian-sounding Central Government Community Development Board. It took ownership of the land from the council. Once the families had been evicted, it sold the land off to a developer, and the developer then sectionalized the development. And what does that mean? Well, with a sectional title, the developer buys a piece of land and builds or renovates apartments on it. And at that point, it's still the landowner. But then the development is sectionalized and passed to individual buyers who form what's called a body corporate, which assumes communal responsibility for the land and buildings, but private individuals own different apartments. So the formal application for Blumhof flats to be sectionalized went in on the 17th of May, 1984. The sectional plan for Skyways was then registered just a week later. The body corporate was established in January 1985. And then the first white residents moved into Skyways later that year. And these were police officers and their families who were given first refusal on apartments in the redevelopment. And today, I looked into who lives in Skyways today, and as much as I could find, it's a mix of homeowners, tenants, student rentals, and Airbnb investors. And so going back to these documents, one of the things that I just want to share just to somebody who, I tend not to do too much archival research, but one of the things I found, and I'd be interested to know if anyone's found this, who's done this kind of research, these documents, they didn't sort of seem like pieces of paper to me, but rather sort of instruments of devastation, right? They're instruments which were profoundly chilling to get your hands on and to read the clinical, cold language. I mean, just as an example here, on the right-hand side there, an owner shall not use his section or permit his section to be used for any purpose which is injurious to the reputation of the building. And then I was thinking, well, this is a place that calls itself Heathrow. And so you find all these ironies, but also a lot of it, if you think of the pain, if you think of the displacement and the dispossession, these sorts, I mean, I'd love to know if anyone can point me to sort of literature which deals with how these documents don't just seem like pieces of paper. There's something much more profound going on when you look at these kinds of things. So just to give you an indication of what District 6 looks like now. So this is 1996. You can see the parking garages that Joe was mentioning there. The swimming pool was put in. This is the technical college that was built on that vacant land. There's a lot of empty land. This is 2011. And you can see some housing appearing here. And again, this is 2024. Joe, do you want us to talk through just this restitution housing that's being
Yes,
put? Yeah, so,
what actually happened is, then of course there was the restitution process and people would apply for restitution.
Hmm.
But the big problem was that a lot of those people in restitution, a lot of them had passed on at anything. Because you look at the time frame, a lot of the old folks, some of them were fortunate to come back. But coming back to some of those spaces, it also created another dimension, and especially in family. If the parents had died, okay, the kids still have the right, but who gets the place? Who does it go to? Then have fight within the family, but who put the property to be? So in many cases, what do they then do? They then sell that property and they divide the money among. But the money's are dead. They can't buy another house because the apartheid system had fallen away. The word apartheid has fallen away. But there's a new word for apartheid, and it's called gentrification. You can live where you want to, if you can afford to. And in this city, if you haven't got that kind of money, you're going to be stuck where you are. You can make improvements where you are in your house, but you're not getting out of it. And that's a sad state of affairs. And even here, where people move into these areas, some of those places were so badly constructed, as I always say, you shut the front door and the back door falls off, because the way they were, it was the corruption and underhand dealings that happened in these kinds of things. And it's very, very sad that as people hoping to come back, have to come back to that kind of.
finally, right. So this is where it's unusual. But you're probably thinking, why hasn't Slater talked about theory yet? Certainly, if you're one of my students, you're thinking, okay, so you're thinking you were going to have an escape from theory. But I just want to talk about some of the analytical lessons, okay? What we know from scholarship and what we might consider, right? And what this maybe teaches us. No? So actually analytical and political lessons. So territorial stigma, which has been a huge literature that's very vibrant and we've written about a lot. One of the things which Loïc Vacan, one of the main people who writes in that register, says is that the stigma of place becomes so powerful it develops a life of its own independently of other forms of stigma. Well, that's not the case with respect to what happened in District 6. The stigma of place and race work together, right, in order to lead to these issues as a repeated slum clearance, or at least places designated as slums that were then cleared. The other thing is that the importance of naming, the importance of symbolic power, as it's being called, right? So Wells Square was then changed to Canterbury Square, and then the Bloemhof Flats was there, and then that was changed to Skyways. District 6 became Zonnebloem, the Afrikaans for sunflower, and then was changed back again. These things, it's not just sort of acts of naming a place, they actually develop material consequences, right? So the symbolic systems don't just reflect realities, but actually produce them. Secondly, thirdly, trauma is, so when I was interviewing people, like I said, in this focus group, which Joe took part in, with I think it was 14 people who attended, the trauma was as visceral now as I think it was 50 years ago. And also, people who came to that day, they brought their children and some brought their grandchildren. And it was interesting talking to them during the breaks in our discussions and saying that how much they feel that pain of displacement. And I don't think in the big literature on displacement, you tend to read too much about that. Another thing is the question of land. Like I said, this has been a site of struggle for over 400 years. Okay, so you have the early kind of, the pre-colonial days, and you have the colonial, hundreds of years of colonial domination. And now you just see more of this in the processes of apartheid, evictions, and then gentrification. And there's this tension between how land is valued economically and how land is actually seen as part of yourself. So there was one participant in the focus group who actually said, the Bloemhof Flats is part of me. I'll never forget that. And she would say, it's a piece of me, right? And so this is how a different understanding of land. Rent gaps, you know about these if you've taken anything with me. These are not squabbles in journals. I don't think we should think of them like that, right? Whether Neil Smith was right or wrong and all that kind of nonsense. Rent gaps are sites of displacement, violence, and immense pain, right? Wherever there is potential value in land, you find tremendous suffering, dislocation. And I think that's actually why that theory was devised. And I think it's easy to forget that. Archival documents, like I said, are not static containers of information. They're instruments of destruction, which have afterlives. You feel it as you read them and hold them. I'm still trying to process how to deal with this. There's a concept coming from geography, domicide, which means the deliberate destruction of home by human agency in pursuit of specified goals. Doug Porteous and Suzanne Smith, who came up with that. But one of the things that I thought about when I was doing those interviews and all the time I've spent with Joe learning about the Blumhof flats is actually reflected in something that a former student of mine wrote. Yongpeng Zhang was a PhD student who worked with me on forced evictions in Shanghai, China. And he says this, so domicide can last for a lifetime because victims retell and relive the narratives of uprooting. Those narratives become an integral part of who they are. Therefore, it's better to understand domicide effects as constantly unfolding and incomplete. They do not cease at the moment of uprooting. I think it's absolutely crucial, and I'm very proud of this student of mine who came up with, he didn't come up with domicide, but I think he was reminding us that displacement is not something that just stops once you're relocated. It lives with you forever for most people. Okay, very few people end up in a better situation. Finally, there's lots to go through, and that's just my last slide. In fact, I'll skip the first few things, but what I do want to say here is that actually the point beginning with community there. Community ties have remained strong almost 50 years after eviction. Far from being an indication that a particular place is not needed for a community, which you could easily read it as, the opposite is true. Blumhof Flats nurtured a community so strong that bonds to the land remain deeply embodied despite that expulsion and scattering that took place. One of the things that was heartwarming in so many ways was seeing how these former neighbors were still acting as if they lived in the Blumhof Flats. At least that's what it appeared like to me. And all these friendships that day were there. And it was just, I felt like I was there the way they were talking about it. The other thing, I know Joe's been accused of this by people who visit the museum and maybe don't get what it's all about. I've been accused of it as somebody who writes about displacement. I know Loretta's been accused of it as somebody who writes about displacement. You're often, people who want to kind of challenge this, who can't cope with it, they say, oh, Slater, you're just romanticizing the past, right? You're saying, oh, how wonderful everything was, and that makes your political argument stronger. I think some of the ladies especially, who I met as part of the Blumhof Flats, if I was to say to them, you're romanticizing your past, I think I know what they would have said to me, right? So these kinds of things, I think, is when sometimes academic debate reaches a limit, okay? And that's, I think, really important. The other thing is having memories, and this is, I'd like to hear Joe's views on this as well, but I think having memories heard and opinions respected is actually part of the process of restoring dignity, finding dignity, when your whole life has been a search for dignity after that humiliation of being evicted. One of the people who took part in the focus group wrote on the ethics form that they all had to sign, right underneath their signature, just wrote, and don't know why they wrote it, but just wrote, we are all here in fellowship. And that's certainly the spirit, I think, with which that day proceeded. And I could probably read out a few more quotations as part of the discussion. But finally, Joe and I want to dedicate this to Joe's late wife, because she was a Blumhof Flats resident who took part in that day. So we thank you for listening, and we're looking forward to your questions.
So we're gonna start with the Q&A. Almost fell there. So please, any questions? Sure, we can start with Stefan.
Thank you both for a tremendous presentation, and the focus on Blumhof Flats allowed for a beautiful reading of history through a very specific place, and it was quite moving. My question is how you were able to convene this group of former residents and the process by which you were able to find everyone, and if people have been able to keep in touch even across geographic dispersion.
Actually, it wasn't difficult. Cell phones and WhatsApp is a hell of a thing these days. So you're always in touch with somebody. And But the spirit of belonging is still there with people. It makes no difference where you are. But the sad part about it is that you've been so far removed from people that you've been engaging with for so long. And suddenly they are all gone. And the next time you hear about them is when they're getting buried and you're attending a funeral. Because distance was the other killer. The expense in having to get from A to B. So slowly but surely, you start losing that close contact, but you don't lose all the contact. And what will happen is that the children or grandchildren will not have that same sort of feeling because they don't know each other. So they won't have that feeling. But parents, yes. And grandparents, yes. They can relate to it. Your younger generation will not be able to relate to that sort of spirit of community that we used to have before. So as somebody had said earlier, yeah, Tom had said, why do you harp on the past? The problem will harp on the past while there's still the past like me to be there, to let people know what was lost. And I'll keep on harping on the past and telling people, if you had been there, you'd know what it's all about. Because you haven't been there, you come along and tell me, forget about it, it's in the past. Bull dust. It's my life that had gone, and that was at the stroke of the pen of somebody who decided that specific area must now belong to somebody with a lighter skin.
I mean, the other thing is I was, as the researcher, not from Cape Town, white, middle class, totally different biography. There was I, and I'd never met these people before. I would never have done this, of course, without having the connection with Joe and the story that we have together. But I do remember when we first sat down to begin the discussion, just to give you an indication of how much ongoing suffering there is and how much uncertainty there is in people's lives. Joe had to say to everybody, even though they knew this already, I think it was the reminder that you gave to everybody, we're not here to allocate you restitution housing, right? And this was a really difficult dynamic to navigate as a researcher, not from Cape Town, to be there, just to learn and act in solidarity and to listen and to take the story seriously was the most important thing I could do, rather than sort of say that there's no material benefit that's going to come from this, but there is something valuable in talking about a past that many people, especially in positions of power, tried to bury. So I think that's one thing I'd say just from my own experience doing this kind of work. It was challenging, very challenging. I'm not sure how well I did. I wouldn't have done it without Joe being there.
I must say, Tom was like a breath of fresh air, where somebody was prepared to listen and do something about it, and not sort of nail us because you're trying to recall the past. It's trying to, the strangest part about it is that parents themselves never told the children, in many cases, what had happened. So they have no clue, especially when they were young. They just grew up in the area, they know that. But it's a case of parents' guilt. Why didn't we stand up? Why didn't we fight? Why didn't we fight for what we had? But unfortunately, in those days, the army, the navy, the police, all the armed forces were in the hands of these so-called white men. And the minute you stood up against them, you became a dissident. You became a communist. And all you were asking, I want to live where I am. Why are you throwing me out? And this is the big problem. And like so many people say, we passed it. And I had said to many of my colleagues I work with, and he said to me that, they gave you new houses, you came out of slums. And I said, okay, big mouth. You leave your car at home for 2 weeks and come and live with me and do everything that we have to do on a daily basis. Then you tell me you've got new houses and tell me to forget about what happened before. And he just backed down. Because if you haven't lived it, you cannot come and talk about it. And this is what a lot of people, they never experience it, but they tell you, oh, forget about it, it's in the past. You must move on. Move on. How can you? Any other questions, Hans?
In the way that you spoke about the like Skyway being marketed, I was just viscerally reminded of the way that like waterfront properties in Gaza are currently being marketed to like foreign people in order to like come and have like a beautiful home in this area where people are actively being displaced. I was just wondering how you both think that the effects of like a similar, you know, displacement, humiliation, as you call it, how we will see those effects in Palestinian communities moving forward.
This is I mean, it's not just Gaza, it's not just Palestinian communities. Anywhere people are involuntarily ripped from their community, you will see these kinds of things happening, because this is why I think my point about symbolic systems is important, because part of the process of gentrification or part of the process of dispossession is burying what was there before, like obliterating the idea that there was any kind of community structure, because it's easier to justify ripping apart a place and displacing people, even killing people. And that people died after they left District 6, right? It's important to know that, you know, people, they didn't just lose their homes, but many people just gave up and died. And so these processes are all connected wherever they happen. And the common thread among them is they are justified by trivializing and dehumanizing lives that were there already. So absolutely, I think that's happening in the context you mentioned, but I would say that it happens wherever I've been reading about places and places I've researched in the past, and certainly it's happening in these examples. And in terms of where you go from here, right, I think one of the reasons Joe and I wanted to do this research was to try and recover a history that had been squashed, right? So the only thing you see that this was ever the Bloemhof flats is a street sign saying Bloemhof. That's all there is, unless you go in the District 6 Museum, which many South Africans don't, Joe tells me. So there's a real need to try and provide and humanize places where people have not been treated as human beings. I don't know if you want to add.
And it would be, strangely enough, you'd find that, as I always say, people living on the other side of the line always say, why do you keep going on about this? Why do you keep on calling back the past? Then I tell them, let's look at it this way. Where you are living now, if tomorrow the systems change and you get thrown out because the color of your skin doesn't warrant you to be there, what would your reaction be? So don't come and tell me we must forget about the past. Just put yourself in that position where it could suddenly happen to you. What would your feelings be? And how would you bury it? It's not something you bury easily, because you've caused so much harm, so much damage, so much pain in what you were doing because of possessions. And that's what's every war, everything that's been fought over is possessions and power. And this is the same thing that happened. Again, possessions. You'd find that only areas of prime property importance were ever declared for white occupation, because they paid people of color next to nothing for their properties, or less than next to nothing when they expropriated it. And in your part of the world, it's known as eminent domain, kicked us out. Then those very same property resold to another race group at inflated prices. So profits were being made on the misery of the color of a person's skin and the areas they lived in. And that is the big problem that we settle with, because all the choice areas that people were moved out of were areas of prime property importance. And that is what District 6 is. And I asked, but why hasn't it been developed? simply because of that very same thing. If they can delay that process long enough and people get fed up and give up on wanting to come back, what do you think those properties are worth? It's going to be worth billions to whoever's still left behind to sell again. And the memory of District 6 will be gone because you'll have gentrification taking over on a big scale. Even an area now called, that used to be called the Boerkaap or the Malay Quarter, there are people living there who are old. But what is happening now is your rates keep on going up. Taxes goes up. Those people can't afford to pay it. So they get kicked out. And who do you think buys it? You see how the fight goes on, the war goes on. Not with ammunition, but through this, the financial fights that go on. And it's destructive, I think, virtually throughout the world. It's happened in so many, it's happened in your country. We have found so many places. In fact, we had a very good talk to one guy from the Bronx, Boston. And he gave us a breakdown. I was gobsmacked to hear what had happened there as well. And so many places, right down the road here, Harlem. The same thing happened. So it's not a case of only, but it's all about enrichment, money, never mind people's.
I think
Yeah.
Loretta had a question, the final.
Two questions. And
Yeah, there's a-
Yeah, yeah. No, Pedro, oh, sorry, I think this was for, oh, we're collecting questions.
Hi, thank you so much, Joe. I wanted to know if you could speak about the Black and colored community's feelings on restorative housing. We see a lot of news reports over in our media where there's a push to retake some of the land from the Boers and their descendants, and the fight where they're saying that's unfair. And I was wondering what restorative housing would look like for you.
Well, there's a thing called the restitution process, which you can go through. But that has also been fraught with a lot of corruption and then dealings. And that is a sad story of our lives at the moment. Because our so-called democracy, quite frankly, in my eyes, has turned into one big democracy, because money is still being made by our supposed to be people who fought for the freedom of this country. And the very people who supposed to be getting back is not getting back because of the money that's being paid for those properties. So they're not going to come into those areas again. So that is the sad state of affairs at the moment. And that is our fight. I think you, Loretta, wanted to, yeah.
Thank you. That was absolutely wonderful. The best thing I've listened to in a long, long time. I have a question. So I've been working for a couple of years on this notion of survivability. So people kind of surviving through this kind of trauma. And one thing I'm quite interested in is how people find alternative homes. So you said people were kind of displaced to, you know, kind of further out. How did they find new homes? What were the kind of mechanics around that?
Well, in most of the cases, the municipality, as I said, built those townships.
Show a few photos that you took.
Yeah. The townships that were built for these people. Now, the townships were built on a very, very cheap scale.
These pictures here.
This is the type of home you got.
So
Some of those
everybody got a replacement.
all over the show, all the displaced people that were placed, they were placed into things like this. And some of these homes were so small, you couldn't even change your mind in it, never mind change your furniture and the damn things. Because when I moved into one of those flats, my bedroom suite couldn't fit into the place. I had to cut off the size of my bed. I couldn't get my wardrobes into the place. I could get one wardrobe in, the other to go and stand in a shed because they couldn't get into that. Now I can imagine what this did to people who've been married 50, 60, 70 years, who had the best of furniture, your stinkwood, your yellowwood, your whatever furniture, they were solid furnitures. They couldn't take it with them. Can you imagine that traumatic experience of having to leave everything behind because you couldn't take it with you, or else sell it to a second-hand dealer who could give you anything that he wanted to because you couldn't have, otherwise had to stay. And I've seen where people's furniture was standing outside because they couldn't take it with them. So it just disappeared. That is the reality of what people had to go through. That is what your apartheid system did to the unfortunate people who were moved out into those areas.
Just the other thing, which for those of you who were not in Joe's lecture yesterday, one of the things we didn't have time to go into is that the map that we showed you of the pattern of segregation by 1979, if you were to put a map on top of that of patterns of segregation in 2024, there'd be very, very little difference, right? If any. There's certainly been some of the southern suburbs, the formerly white areas, have become more mixed, but the poorest areas of Cape Town, where there are so many problems and so many levels, are still deeply racially divided and segregated. And so this is one of the struggles, is to try and, for Joe anyway, as much as Joe's been telling me about what he's been doing, the difficulty is getting South Africans to understand that history as well, right?
You see, the big thing is that apartheid had been geared. It's been so well, it was so well formed that it's going to take generations to get the mindsets of people changed. Because while you are still living in those specific areas, as it says, democracy means you can live where you want to if you can afford to. But even if you can go into an area and you are not of the same color, you are still not going to be accepted easily. Although they say it's gone. But up here, it was so well brainwashed that it's very, very difficult. And I always say it's coming through our young generation. They are learning the differences. But while you have those lines of democracy, who lives here, who lives there, it's not going to work. And although they've taken it out of the statute books, but in the minds, it's still there. And that is our big problem. And that will go generations maybe. But if your people can't move up where they are and you're stuck into gang-ridden areas, who's going to be buying an area that you don't know if you open your front door, bullets going to come through the front door? That is what we settle with at the moment, because COVID didn't help either. And of course, your job reservations and all those things that go with our problems that we had. If we take an area called out in the, what is the name of that area out in the West Coast? Atlantis. Now, Atlantis, I just called it the lost city because that's what it became. They promised they're going to have industries. They promised there's going to be a railway line. They promised the people, and the people went there. And what do they come to? Absolutely nothing. They are stuck out there, and they have to still travel in. Can you imagine 50, 60 Ks a day traveling in and out to come to work? Can you imagine the expense? And this is the sad state of affairs. And there's no railway line that's gone through there. You cannot have industry if you don't have railway lines. It can't be. You can't be using the roads because the roads is being used by everybody. So this is the problem. The other problem that we settle with. There's such a lot of promises been made that has never been fulfilled. So we'll be stuck with this for the next couple of years until somebody wakes up and smells the roses and say, this is what we should be doing.
So on behalf of GSAP and urban planning in particular, I would like to thank you again, Dr. Schaffers and Professor Slater, for this insightful presentation. We will appreciate you taking the time to share your work with us.
Thank you.
And a quick reminder that we will have our lecture in planning series next week up in Ware Lounge with Professor Nancy Kwak talking about housing security at a global scale, a history. So I hope you can join us again next week. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, no. Yeah, I mean, it's really.
That was a good number.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
apprehensive, but okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Usually when it's difficult, it's